and vote just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what?
In early 2026, President Donald Trump publicly urged Republicans to nationalize the voting and even take over the voting in at least 15 places. Comments that jolted election officials and constitutional scholars alike. According to public reporting, his remarks came amid an extraordinary FBI search of a Georgia election office and renewed assertions of fraud disproven by courts and independent reviews. Trump's language injected a new layer of uncertainty into the midterm election cycle, even as the Constitution reserves election administration largely to the states, setting up a collision between political pressure and institutional safeguards. President Trump's recent interventions on election administration have marked a significant departure from traditional norms. On a conservative podcast in early February 2026, Trump said Republicans should take over the voting in at least 15 places, and that they ought to nationalize the voting, framing his call as necessary to ensure Republican success and election integrity. Trump's posture reflects a belief that asserting federal authority over election mechanics can reshape outcomes in his party's favor. Yet this view collides with constitutional and legal boundaries. According to scholars and election law experts, the Constitution gives states primary responsibility for setting the times, places, and manner of federal elections, with only limited authority granted to Congress to legislate national standards. State and local election officials were quick to push back. In the days following Trump's remarks, officials in several states, including Republican leaders in Indiana, emphasized that election administration should remain under state control. Meanwhile, Democratic governors issued statements condemning the idea as an overreach of presidential power. This mismatch between Trump's rhetoric and constitutional structure lays bare a critical miscalculation. The power to legislate or administer elections does not reside in the presidency alone. State officials, courts, and Congress all have roles that act as structural constraints. As Trump escalates public pressure, those constitutional guardrails are exerting counterpressure, underscoring that authority and political aspiration are not the same. Trump's claims resonate with supporters, but constitutional inertia and institutional resistance are already in motion. Trump's comments ignited more than political reaction. They triggered legal and constitutional scrutiny. Even before this latest round of rhetoric, experts reiterated that the executive branch has no direct authority to nationalize voting. According to legal analysis, federal election administration is inherently a function of the states, rooted in Article 1, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution, with congressional power limited to setting some standards but not taking over administration itself. Despite this, the Trump administration has taken actions that some view as pushing at the edges of these boundaries. In late January, an FBI search warrant was executed at the Fulton County, Georgia election office, seizing ballots and other materials from the 2020 election under seal. According to reporting, that operation raised alarm among election officials who saw increased federal involvement in what is traditionally a state domain. Legal experts note that past attempts to use federal authority to intervene in election processes have faced significant barriers. Courts have repeatedly dismissed or rebuffed cases seeking to overturn election results when evidence of systemic fraud was lacking, reinforcing the threshold of proof required for judicial action in this arena. State officials, including Republicans, are pushing back in court and public sessions. For example, several states have resisted federal demands for voter roll data, leading to ongoing lawsuits. These conflicts underscore a structural truth. Even if the presidency proposes a sweeping role for the federal government, constitutional, statutory, and judicial limits constrain how far that proposal can be implemented. Trump's public push for federal election influence appears rooted more in political strategy than legal authority. The courts, by design, serve as a check on executive overreach. Their reluctance to endorse expansive federal election control, especially without clear statutory mandate, reflects the deep separation of powers that shapes election law. As Trump's rhetoric continues, legal challenges are poised to test the limits of executive influence, potentially dragging federal courts deeper into midterm election disputes. As the midterm elections approach, Trump's strategy has shifted from isolated comments to sustained pressure around election administration. His call to nationalize voting and take over the voting in at least many 15 places was more than a rhetorical flourish. It became a central talking point for his political allies and a source of alarm for opponents. Trump's messaging leans on unproven claims of widespread fraud and suggests that state-based election systems are inherently flawed. Yet experts, including voices within the Republican Party, have pointed out that such assertions lack evidence and, in many instances, that election systems have repeatedly been validated by bipartisan officials. Institutional backlash was swift and multi-layered. State election officials, the very administrators Trump's comments target, have publicly expressed unease about increased federal involvement. According to reporting, some officials noted that Trump's rhetoric has already created confusion and anxiety within local election offices preparing for the midterms. Even within the Republican coalition, there are fractures. Republican leaders in several states defended the traditional authority of state election systems and rejected the idea that the federal government should assume control. This internal resistance highlights a blind spot in Trump's strategy. While his base may rally around aggressive rhetoric, the institutional apparatus that actually runs election secretaries of state, local election boards, and state legislatures operates independently and often with bipartisan cooperation. Legal institutions are also pushing back. The ongoing litigation over federal demands for voter data in multiple states remains unresolved, and courts have thus far upheld the requirement that substantial statutory authority must exist before compelling states to surrender control. In Washington, congressional Democrats have publicly vowed to resist any effort by the executive branch to exert undue influence over the election process, framing Trump's comments as an attempt to undermine democratic norms. According to reports, House Democratic leaders said they would prevent any effort to nationalize the midterms, underscoring the partisan clash shaping the narrative. The clash also shaped public perception. Polling, public statements, and commentary from across the political spectrum indicate that voters themselves are wary of federal overreach into a process historically managed at the state level. Election experts argue that preserving public confidence in the integrity of elections requires adherence to established legal frameworks, not provocations that stoke mistrust. Trump's approach has heightened tension around the 2026 midterms, but it also crystallized institutional boundaries. The presidency can advocate, cajole, and criticize, but it cannot rewrite the constitutional allocation of power unilaterally. As legal restraints and political opposition converge, Trump's leverage appears constrained by the very institutions he seeks to pressure. With midterms looming, Trump's continued escalation could deepen institutional pushback and widen political fractures. Institutional resistance to Trump's calls for federal control over elections has been steady and bipartisan. Across the states, election officials, whether Democratic or Republican, emphasize that they are prepared to defend the constitutional allocation of authority that places election administration primarily in their hands. According to reporting, officials have expressed unease about federal involvement after high-profile raids and rhetoric suggesting federal domination of election processes. The backlash is not limited to administrative officials. Legislative bodies, from state houses to Congress, have pushed back against presidential suggestions that the federal government should assume a greater role. Even some members of Trump's own party have openly rejected the idea, arguing that it would undermine the legitimacy of elections and provoke legal challenges without clear statutory backing. Legal scholars and constitutional experts also weigh in, asserting that the assertion of federal electoral control lacks legal foundation and is likely to be struck down if pursued through executive action. Courts are hesitant to entertain sweeping claims of authority absent explicit legislative mandate, a reality that serves as a brake on executive ambition. The broader consequence of these conflicts is a growing erosion of public trust. When political leaders cast doubt on the integrity of electoral systems without evidence, they risk undermining citizen confidence. Pollsters and analysts have noted increased skepticism about election fairness, even in areas with no substantiated irregularities. While precise causes are multifaceted, Trump's persistent rhetoric contributes to an atmosphere of doubt. This environment creates a paradox. Trump aims to strengthen his party's prospects by questioning election procedures, yet that very strategy appears to be corroding the public's belief in the legitimacy of the system. In doing so, he narrows his own political space. Without broad public confidence, asserting federal authority becomes harder, not easier. Institutional resistance and eroding trust suggest that Trump's tactics may impair confidence in elections, even if they fail to alter actual administration. As the 2026 midterm elections near, Donald Trump faces a narrowing set of options. His public calls for federal control over election administration and his rhetoric about taking over voting have galvanized supporters but collided with constitutional reality. The U.S. Constitution entrusts election administration primarily to states, and courts have reinforced that federal authority in this realm is limited absent explicit legislative action. Institutional resistance has grown more pronounced. State officials remain committed to administering elections within their legal purview, and even Republican leaders have pushed back against expanded federal involvement. Congressional Democrats have vowed to oppose efforts that appear to undermine democratic norms, framing Trump's comments as antithetical to constitutional order. The consequences for Trump's political strategy are tangible. Instead of consolidating influence over midterm outcomes through executive pronouncements, he must contend with legal barriers, institutional pushback, and public skepticism. His remaining options are constrained. He can either temper his language and work within constitutional channels, such as advocating for election law changes through Congress, or persist with rhetoric that deepens divisions without delivering structural change. Ultimately, Trump's influence over elections will be shaped not by rhetoric alone, but by the interplay between political ambition and constitutional constraint. The question before 2026 is not whether he wants to nationalize elections, but whether the institutions designed to protect electoral integrity will hold firm.